The United States has carried out a military strike inside Nigeria, targeting armed groups in the Northwest, something the US president had earlier promised. And coming on Christmas Day, this is being presented quite literally as America's idea of a Christmas gift to Nigeria. But before reacting to the symbolism or the timing, it's important to understand how a decision like this is actually made. This strike did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen emotionally. That point matters because it immediately separates analysis from reaction. Military actions of this kind are never impulsive. They are the final output of a long internal process that begins quietly, long before the public ever becomes aware that something is changing. When a country like the United States authorizes a strike outside its borders, especially in a place that is not an active war zone, the decision has already moved through layers of intelligence review, legal interpretation, diplomatic consideration, and strategic calculation. By the time a strike is executed, the debate is no longer about whether to act, but about how to act in a way that minimizes risk while achieving a specific objective. So, the real question is not what happened on the day of the strike, but what changed before it. Why this operation was triggered. What likely triggered this operation was not a single attack or isolated incident. Intelligence agencies do not operate that way. They look for patterns over time, not individual events. And in northwest Nigeria, those patterns appear to have shifted. For years, violence in the northwest was categorized as banditry. That label shaped how the problem was understood and how it was managed. Banditry implies criminal motivation, fragmented groups, limited coordination, and local objectives. It is brutal, but it is not usually strategic. What intelligence services seem to have observed, however, was behavior that no longer fit that model. Armed groups began moving in more coordinated ways. Their communications became more disciplined. Their financing methods appeared more structured, and their tactics increasingly resembled those used by jihadist groups operating elsewhere. This is where classification becomes decisive. Because once armed groups start behaving like transnational jihadist cells, the response framework changes completely. Why the ISIS link changes everything. This distinction is critical. Banditry is primarily a domestic security issue. It is violent and destabilizing, but it remains within the internal responsibility of the state. Once a group shows operational or ideological alignment with the Islamic State network, however, it becomes an international security concern. For the United States, this is not negotiable. U.S. counterterrorism doctrine treats ISIS affiliates as part of a global threat network, regardless of where they operate. Geography does not insulate a group from attention. If intelligence suggests that an ISIS foothold is forming, the assumption is that early disruption is preferable to later containment. That doctrine has shaped U.S. operations across multiple regions over the past 2 decades. It explains why the threshold for action is not mass casualties or territorial control, but credible signs of organizational alignment, external linkage, and long-term intent. At some point, northwest Nigeria appears to have crossed that threshold. The strike itself was almost certainly the product of joint intelligence cooperation. Nigerian agencies would have provided detailed ground-level knowledge, locations, movement patterns, known safe havens, and the social terrain in which these groups operate. The United States would have contributed advanced surveillance, signals intelligence, and strike execution capability. This division of labor reflects a model the US has used repeatedly in Africa. Avoid large troop deployments, rely on local intelligence, and intervene selectively when threats are assessed to be escalating beyond local containment. This approach is designed to reduce long-term entanglement while maintaining the ability to act decisively when specific criteria are met. Why Northwest Nigeria matters. The choice of Northwest Nigeria, particularly Sokoto State, is revealing. For over a decade, Nigeria's security focus has centered on the Northeast, where Boko Haram and ISWAP operate. The Northwest was treated differently, violent, unstable, but conceptually separate from insurgency. Labeling the Northwest as a bandit zone allowed the crisis there to be framed as a policing challenge rather than an ideological one. This strike suggests that framing has changed. It indicates that at least some armed groups in the region are now believed to have crossed a line from criminal violence into organized jihadist activity. That assessment would not be made lightly. It would require sustained intelligence confidence and corroboration across multiple sources. Once that line is crossed, the strategic calculus shifts rapidly. Military intent and limits of the strike. From a military perspective, the strike was almost certainly designed to be precise and limited. The objective would not have been territorial control or long-term occupation. Those goals require sustained deployments and carry significant political and operational costs. Instead, the goal would have been disruption, removing key figures, degrading operational capacity, destroying infrastructure that enables coordination, and forcing networks to fragment. But disruption is not resolution. It is a temporary advantage, not a permanent solution. And that is where the risks begin. Airstrikes can neutralize targets, but they can also scatter fighters into neighboring regions or push them deeper into civilian populations. That makes future intelligence collection harder and increases risks to civilians. There is also the propaganda risk. Groups linked to ISIS have consistently used foreign intervention to reinforce recruitment narratives, framing themselves as defenders against external aggression. Even a tactically successful strike can carry strategic costs if those narratives gain traction. Political implications for Nigeria. Politically, the strike raises uncomfortable questions for Nigeria. Why did it require foreign military involvement for this threat to be addressed at this level? Were there intelligence gaps, resource limitations, or political constraints that delayed action? And what does this say about the state's capacity to manage evolving security threats independently? Perhaps the most important question is what happens after the strike. A single operation does not defeat an insurgency. At best, it buys time. Time is only valuable if it is used strategically. Long-term security depends on what follows: sustained intelligence cooperation, improved local security capacity, protection of civilian populations, and disruption of the economic networks that allow armed groups to survive. Without those follow-up measures, strikes risk becoming isolated events rather than parts of a coherent strategy. Conclusion and strategic meaning. This strike marks a turning point, not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. It signals that Nigeria's internal security crisis is no longer viewed purely as a domestic matter. It has entered the realm of international counter-terrorism, where decisions are shaped by global threat assessments rather than local narratives alone. Whether this development leads to greater stability or deeper complications will depend less on what happened in the air and more on what happens on the ground afterward. The strike itself is a moment. The response that follows will determine whether it becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long, unresolved conflict.